to Mimamsa Foundation for Indic Studies 4th Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture. Mimamsa Foundation for Indic Studies is a forum where we attempt to contemplate, study, research about India in a well-authentic, objective, and rigorous Indian way. And we do that through well-researched articles, research projects, podcasts, interviews, workshops, study groups, and much more. Do visit www.mfisonline.org, our website, to stay yourself updated with our latest activities, endeavors, and also read some of our scholarly works that has been published on the website. Mimamsa Foundation for Indic Study constituted Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture as a tribute to the scholarly pursuits in economy, polity, and society of Justice Ranade on one hand, and his indefatigable spirit to work for social, political, and national cause to make India a better place. But over the years, some of his works have become less known, have suffered some sense of obscurity. So this is one of our way to bring back some of these insightful works to larger audience. So each year on 16th of January, we have Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture being delivered by eminent intellectuals, public intellectuals, scholars to talk about their emerging research, something that can benefit India as well as can help us understand India in a better way. And we are indeed privileged to have Dr. Shamika Ravi deliver this year's Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture. Dr. Ravi is currently a member of Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister and also a Secretary to Government of India. Previously, she was Director of Research at Brookings India, Vice President of Economic Policy at Observer Research Foundation, and non-resident fellow of Governance Studies Program at the Brookings Institution. Her research focuses primarily on economics of development, including areas of finance, healthcare, urbanization, gender equality, and welfare and poverty. And for today's session, she will be primarily speaking on his new research about about what inequality status talk is actually really is, how has it changed over the years, how some of the governmental schemes have actually reflected on the ground, and what are new ways, what are the new avenues, what are the new data that can be used to study and provide a more accurate, insightful picture about India, not only to as an information, but also which can be used pertinently for policy prescriptions as well. So we are indeed happy and delighted to have Dr. Ravi. And Dr. Ravi, thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Much for inviting me to deliver Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture of this year. I feel very honored. And I'm going to take this opportunity to familiarize the wider audience on what the current update of the Indian economy is. Because while there is a lot of talk about it, there is little empirical evidence that is put out in the common press. So there tends to be confusion regarding certain basic structural things. And today I'm therefore going to present some of the latest research, which, as papers, they're in the public domain. But I'm going to run you through that. For those of you interested, please download and read the whole paper. That truly will make this endeavor. And if you are familiar with the writings of Justice Ranade, you will know the kind of rigor that he tried to bring into economic thinking and policy making in India. So in many ways, we are trying to resuscitate those old traditions and those old philosophies where really policy making is motivated by a common person and a common Indian. And in this case, I'm going to talk about new data, new India, and a policy perspective. Basically, I'm going to present some new evidence, as I mentioned. What is happening to consumption in India? Why am I talking about consumption? Because traditionally, we measure poverty in terms of how much a person can live off or how much does a person spend. Spending or consumption is a very important metric of that. It has been 10 years that we have got this kind of detailed household level consumption data on exactly what people are buying and how much are they consuming. So therefore, it is important to talk about it. I will also talk a little bit about labor force participation, because labor markets, jobs are a very important component of policy making. And many of you might be familiar with the fact that for the last 20 years or so, there has been a very large industry or a body of research literature that has been built around explaining the declining labor force of women in India, a great cause of concern. But I look at the latest data. I look at data from the last 10 years, and I see massive reversals and massive surge in that. So I want to present to you data with that regard. And remember, everything that I'm talking to you about is based on publicly available data. So this is data which are of the largest sample sizes across the country. It's done by Ministry of Statistics and Planning, and it is made available regularly. So I also encourage the younger audience, researchers in the audience, to replicate some of these, right? Our aim is not just to inform policy making or inform the larger global community and India watchers or India economy watchers, but our job is also to motivate young scholarship, younger people to follow through on what the real promise of Vikasit Bharat is. And obviously it'll happen on the backs of your scholarship as well. So I do hope to motivate some of you to take this forward. Then the third big tranche in this talk will be based on new kinds of data. We are no longer limited to data collected only through human endeavor in terms of responding to questionnaires. Now we have a lot of satellite data available, extremely high, high resolution, 10 meter into 10 meter kind of satellite data available during the daytime, which means we know exactly what is getting constructed where in the country. And that is a very good way to measure what is happening to growth and progress as well. So these are the three broad set of things I'm going to present to you. Please remember, the motivation of all of this is to feed into the idea of India becoming Vikasit or a developed nation by 2047. So the first question is, how has India's consumption pattern changed in the last 10 years? And the answer is really truly dramatic. If we see that in the last 10 years, the Ministry of Statistics and Planning, Government of India, has put together a massive data set, highly representative, over 1 lakh households 10 years back, and almost more than 2.5 times more households in the recent round, which was only last year. And what do we see? We see, in terms of average monthly per capita consumption expenditure, meaning an average person's spending per month, we have seen 164% increase in rural areas. This is a remarkable and a major jump. And in urban areas, it is around 146, which is also a very, very large change. But remember, in India, because the nature of our data collection is such that it makes sense to do your estimates at rural and urban separately. Don't try to put weightage, because remember, this is a country which is urbanizing very fast. And as of the last census of 2011, 35% of the country was urban. But we have beaten all projections since then. In fact, if you look at satellite data, you look at density of people living in area or the kind of work people do, India is anywhere between 65 and 70% urban today. So we are a very rapidly urbanizing economy. Now I'm going to break it up and show you what are the big trends. What has happened in India in the last 10 years? Well, for the first time, food is now less than half the overall monthly per capita consumption expenditure. This is a great marker of progress. The more affluent, the more prosperous, the richer, more developed a nation, smaller the share of food in the overall spending. And India seems to have now crossed that hull. We are less than 50%. I'll give you the breakup of rural and urban. But very interestingly, we want to also disaggregate and see what is happening. Food is becoming more diverse, right? People from every quintile, the rich and the poor, are not just spending more on food, they're actually eating many varieties of food now. The diversity on the food plate has risen in remarkable ways. And is this important? Yes, because it has a direct bearing on health outcomes, right? In terms of measures of anemia, etc. And I'm going to show you all those links in this talk. Another great finding is asset ownership, especially amongst the poorest population, which means the poorest 20% in the population. If you just look at the kind of assets that this class owns, there is a remarkable increase. And I'm not going to talk about assets which the governments provide, right, in the form of, let's say, a toilet or a house. No, I'm going to talk about automobiles. I'm going to talk about vehicular ownership, etc. Because the reason is it should not be something directly given by the government. That's not the idea here. This is really a marker of growth and development overall. Households are buying this on their own. And that's why these are very, very good metrics to look at. Then, I'm a keen, researcher as far as health and educational outcomes are concerned, because development cannot happen without human capital progressing or improving in very fundamental ways. So I look at the data in terms of what happens to vulnerability of Indian households when they're hit by hospitalization. Now, traditionally, and this is an estimate I carried out in 2014-15, when the last NFHS rounds were available, National Family Health Survey, that 7% of Indians become impoverished because of hospitalization. Right? When you're hit with a health shock, you fall below the poverty line. But now that we are in the realm of, development where absolute poverty is below 3%. So it's not just absolute poverty or impoverishment per se that should be the focus of our interest merely, but we also have to look at other measures. And I look at vulnerability, because vulnerability holds for all classes of people, the rich and the poor. And if you look at all quintiles or all decile, meaning if you break up the overall population into 10%, then if you're hit by a hospitalization, and if you fall below your normal consumption class, then it is a mark of vulnerability. So even affluent or middle class, upper middle class households, when they have a major hospitalization, and let's say somebody in your family unfortunately is in the hospital for, let's say, 7 days, massive bills work up. And then you basically cut down on consumption. You travel less, or you buy fewer items, luxury items, etc. Right? So think of vulnerability not just as something relative to poor, it's for all classes. And that's why these are new evolving measures that we are developing to understand what is happening to India's quality of life. Right? The policy implications of all these empirical things that I'm presenting to, I will present to you, are very many. Because remember, how does it feed into policy? Number one, as food becomes a smaller fraction of overall spending, it has a direct bearing on the way we estimate inflation. Right? Inflation is a very core policy target. As you know, our Reserve Bank, which is a central bank, is now on the inflation targeting kind of an objective, which means its core objective is to keep inflation below certain, or within a certain bandwidth. Now, if that is the case, and inflation, as you know, hits everyone, and it hits the poor particularly. So inflation is something we have to have a better estimate of. But if food is now going to be a smaller share of your overall spending, then the nature of the inflation that we estimate, that framework must also change, which means the weightage that we give to different things that we consume, what are we likely to be hit by? What should concern us more? The weights on our consumption basket, the weights on different things will now get altered because the consumption pattern is now altering, right? It is changing and developing. So it has a direct impact on consumer price index, or the way we calculate inflation. Then, if people are eating differently, in 10 years, you have seen a remarkable change in the kind of eating habits. It must also get reflected in our agriculture policy, which means what we are producing. Right? And you will see that in a minute, that households on an average are eating less carbohydrates. They're eating more of all other food items, right? All other kinds of food groups. But that means production must now keep up with the changing food habits, which is what growth and prosperity is about. So it affects agriculture policy immediately. Health and nutrition policy, depending on what you eat and how much you eat, etc., it directly impacts, and I'm going to show you results for anemia. Because anemia is a problem we have struggled with for many years now, several decades. And finally, we are seeing that we are moving the needle to simply, better eating, because households are now less poor, they're becoming richer, and more food is available everywhere in the country. So that is having a direct impact on anemia and health outcomes. And then, of course, urban planning. When vehicular ownership throughout the country changes in urban or rural areas, you're having a massive surge in ownership of vehicles. We have to actually think of planning. Many of our cities are expanding at a rate which is unprecedented, which means many areas that we think are villages or, which are being governed by panchayats are, in reality, they have become townships, right? And there is great amount of vehicular ownership, and all this data I will show you, but there is a reason I have picked out these variables of interest. And urban planning, because now perhaps many of our villages are actually cities, they are townships, and we have to think of planning, and we have to think of these core changes on the ground, and the governance and the administration, and of course financing must keep up with the changes on the ground. So let's start by first looking at what is an average spending and how has it changed in 10 years. If you look at food on an average used to be 53% before, and this is rural India, mind you. Now it is 47% in rural India, right? And if I show you for urban, then it is even lower. In urban India, food is only 39% of the overall spending. So big changes. Going back to rural. Within food, cereal used to be 11% of a monthly per capita consumption in rural area. 11% of your budget used to go towards cereals, rice, wheat, etc. Today, that number is down to 5%, right? So it's not just a declining share. Remember, there are overall changes happening. So now you're spending actually far less on cereals. Spending on processed and packaged food has increased significantly. These are the big changes happening. So less on cereals, more on fruits, more on eggs, fish and meat, more on milk, and more on packaged and processed food. Each of them have a bearing on different kinds of policies. Quite worryingly, pan, tobacco, and alcohol used to be 2% of rural India's spending, an average households. Now it is 5%. It's a larger share of a growing pie. Remember, overall spending has increased 164% for rural India, and now it is 5% of a larger pie that is going into pan, tobacco, and alcohol. But that's not where the worry ends, right? The concern is that if you look at the poorer segment in this, the bottom 2 quintile, or the bottom 50% or the 40%, then you see that the poorer households in rural India today are spending more on pan, tobacco, and intoxicants than they are spending on education and health, right? These are very important findings on the ground to then shape our policy, that what should we now do to make it viable from the households, improving quality of life. We do want all Indians to have better quality of life, but it does not mean the responsibility ends with the government alone. Policy making, there is of course the government's role, but there is also a larger public health perspective to this, right? And that means there is a role for community, for campaigns, for changing habits. And this movement is definitely not in the right direction, so we must address this. Spending on conveyance. Rural India used to spend 4% of its overall budget, monthly budget, on conveyance. Now it spends 7%. So it's spending a lot more money on conveyance. Well, the good thing is, of course, roads are there, and even in the most remote areas, so people are traveling and spending more. And also people own more vehicles, and I'll show you the data. So overall, you're spending more on mobility and conveyance and other things. Now, the policy implication in many times in this such findings is, should we then improve public transport? What should we think of? What are the routes along which there is, greater mobility? And these are rural India, by the way. I'm not talking about cities, right? So you might want to think of mobility, if you think of people commuting generally we think of only in terms of cities. But now we find even in rural areas, people are spending a large amount of their monthly expenditure on conveyance. Urban India changes are very similar, just the magnitude is different. Again, in urban India, 7% of the monthly budget used to be on cereal. Look at that, it has fallen to 4%, right? So it is everyone in urban and rural is now consuming and spending much less on cereals, which used to be a very dominant component. And of course, they're spending more on processed and packaged food. They're spending more on conveyance. So it's similar trends. The magnitudes are different. So overall, just very quickly, if I'm to sum up, share of food is less than 50%, first time in modern India. Share of cereal, rice and wheat has fallen sharply. Share of packaged and processed food has risen fast. Share of conveyance is rising fast. The share of pan, tobacco, and alcohol has doubled, right? And particularly rural areas and bottom segments of the quintiles, it has risen far more. And share of jewelry, ornaments, again, different kinds of asset ownership, that is increasing, particularly amongst the poorest. I'm just presenting the same data in a different way. The top 5 bars are for 10 years back. The bottom 5 bars are for the latest round, meaning 22-23. Do you see the red bar within the total bar expanding? And this is for all quintile groups. So the poorest to the richest. And you're seeing for everybody, that red bar, which is cereals, do you see it is shrinking in the bottom 5 graphs? Which means now against the previous chart where I showed you average for all, here I'm showing you by wealth category. So from the poorest to the richest households, everybody's eating less and spending less on cereals. Everybody's spending more. Look at the white portion, that is milk and milk product, is consuming more milk and milk product. You're spending more on processed and packaged food. In fact, look at the top 10%. They used to spend 15% of their money on processed and packaged food. What is it now? It's 18%. Okay, so, and remember, these are percentages of rising pie. Overall budget has increased and a larger share of a larger budget. Spending on fruits has increased. Spending on eggs, fish, and meat. Every quintile, rich to the poor, are consuming more of non-cereal food. So this is for rural. Urban looks very similar. In fact, in urban India, just look at packaged and processed food. The top 10% is spending 27.2% on packaged and processed food. Right? That's a very big increase. At the same time, 7.8% spending on cereals. So they're spending very little on cereals. Okay? Big changes, which means there are big policy implications and public health. Now, I want to go a little further to now tell you what is the richness of the exercise itself and how rigorous these things have to be to really inform policy. Look at the proportion of rural households that consumed some kind of fresh fruits. And the bars or the chart on the left-hand side is for 10 years back, and the right-hand side is for the latest data. What do you see? That 10 years back, 63.8% households reported consuming some fresh fruits. Now that number is in excess of 90%. Do you see this, the remarkable increase in terms of number? Everyone is consuming fresh fruits. That's what it means. And if you look at the quintile groups from the top 20 to the bottom 20, everyone has seen. Do you see for each quintile or consumption class, for each class of people, consumption of fresh fruits has really shot up such that the average is 90%. So this is a big change. But that's not all. We are also concerned about inequality. Right? And here we see, in terms of consumption, inequality in India is falling rapidly. Why do I say that? That 43% more people overall have said that they are consuming fresh fruits. This is average. But if you look at the poorest 20%, then 86% more people amongst the poorest are reporting to consume some fresh fruits. Which means the biggest increases are really in the poorest classes. This is for rural, and you will find the same thing for urban. Now, I want to go a step further because this data is so fantastic. You can also see how many kilograms, not just I am eating some fruits, but how many kilograms am I actually consuming? That is what this one tells you. Do you see between 11, 12 and 22, 23, what a remarkable increase in the length of these blue bars have happened in 10 years? On an average 10 years back, an average household used to consume 1.9 kilogram of fresh fruits per week, per person, right? That has now increased. Look at it. It's a 42% increase. Now it's 2.7 kilogram per person. But what about the poorest 20%? Amongst the poorest, the increase in the actual quantity is 87%. So you are seeing even in terms of quantity, the biggest increases are at the bottom of the pyramid. And that is where if you see the quantity consumed by the top and the bottom, overall, the top used to consume 4 times more than the bottom 10 years back. Today, that difference is 2.8 times. So do you see there is a convergence? That consumption inequality is actually declining in India. That's a good thing. Now, if I look at urban India, the findings are very similar. Quantity of fresh fruits, 30% overall increase. But in the poorest category, 54% increase. Where are these increases happening? By the way, I'm showing you results only for fresh foods because of paucity of time, but I do request you to download the paper and look at these results for all different food categories, like milk and milk products, vegetables, eggs, fish, and meat. Big increases everywhere. And the biggest increases are in the bottom 20% to bottom 40%. Where is this now geographically? Where is this big increase? You know, sometimes we worry that the nature of growth in India is concentrated in some states or is concentrated in one zone or one region or in cities, right? If you look at this data, just look at 2011-12 and compare it with the right side panel, which is 22-23. Every region of the country, from north, central, east, northeast, west, and south. Do you see that all these bars have become much longer? Each region of the country has seen a major increase, but that's not all. And by the way, you have states within those regions as well. The biggest increases are in the most underserved, where your bars were shortest, right? Or the most remote part. Just look at northeast, the green bars. In the northeast, less than 60% households used to consume. Right? Look at them. They're all above 90% now. Every state of the Northeast. Now, is this a story of only more affluence and people having more money and so on? No, that is only half the story. The other half is that fruits are now available everywhere. So, which is really an indication of what is happening to the supply side or the logistics, right? What has happened to this massive infrastructure expansion? Right? The back-end logistics, the supply chain, which has improved dramatically in the last 10 years, it has a direct bearing on consumption and quality of life of citizens throughout the country. That is what this is indicating. Milk and milk products, 16% overall increase. Here, 16% is less than the previous food categories because milk and milk products, remember, in India, we have had a revolution flood long back, right? So we have been many parts of India has had access to milk, yet you've had a 16% increase overall on an average. But for the bottom 20%, there is a 34% increase. So again, it is showing a convergence. It is showing a reduction in consumption inequality. If you look at the quantity, 10% kilograms or liters per person per month, 10% is the increase overall. But for the bottom 20% amongst the poorest, 45% increase. Again, inequality in terms of consumption is declining. Eggs, fish, and meat, 25%. So unlike this one concern that the country is largely vegetarian and so on, yes, it might be. Or, you know, these are open empirical questions. But 25% increase has happened in terms of number of people consuming eggs, fish, and meat. Okay. And 36% if you consider the bottom 20%. So there is, again, a very large increase at the bottom compared to the average. And in terms of quantity, just look at the magnitude. 45% increase in terms of the actual kilogram of eggs, fish, and meat consumed by people. And for the bottom, the poorest, 80% increase. That's like, it's almost a doubling of the amount of eggs, fish, and meat people are consuming at the poorest category, right? So again, there is a convergence happening. Quantity of cereal. Now, this is the story emerging. That all these food groups you have seen, people are eating more, right? What about cereals? Cereals, if you compare 11-12 with 22-23, on an average Indian used to consume 10.8 kilograms. So let's say almost 11 kilograms. Now they're consuming 8.7 kilograms. So there's a 2 kilogram reduction in quantity of cereals consumed. And by the way, the most interesting thing, overall, there is a 20% decline. And for the poorest category also, there is a 20% decline. So it is not just that the rich are eating more of everything else and eating less rice, wheat. Even the poorer households are eating less of rice and wheat, and they are eating more of all these other things. Remember, this is quantity of consumption, not spending. That's why this is such a remarkable finding and an actual change on the ground. Even your poorest households are now eating less of carbohydrates, and they're eating more of all these other food groups. Same thing in urban India, right? 18% overall decline and 18% for the poorest. So similar, there is no wealth effect happening here. Everyone is eating less cereals in India. What is happening? Well, India has had a free food grains program for some time now. You know, after the pandemic, under the Food Security Act, under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, this was a time when the government took a very conscious decision that we don't want any hunger death because we have abundance of food. So one of the critical policy interventions or decision was that food grains were going to be made available everywhere to a very large segment of people. Today, I often, I hear people who misunderstand these things, or they look at it in sort of myopic way. Oh, why are 80 crore people eligible? Why should free food be given? It's an indication of things not going fine, right? The point is you have to look at these things from pragmatic fiscal standpoint. You do have abundance of food grains in this country. That's number one, right? Number two, what you have effectively done, or what India has effectively done, is it has fiscalized the food plate. By the government bearing the cost of cereals, of free food grains, and therefore by making it available, their savings from buying cereals for the bottom 60%, the savings are being channeled into all these other food groups. Okay, this is what fiscalization of the food plate means, that your savings from food grains are being channeled into fresh fruits, milk and milk products, eggs, fish, and meat, etc. So the rest of the market is now expanding because consumption of these items are expanding. Households are spending and eating larger quantities of these alternate items. So please remember, fiscalization of the food plate has happened in India in the last 5-6 years, and particularly after the pandemic. Of course, there's much more happening because your supply chain has improved so much. I want to show you a magical result almost. Look at the panel on the left and compare it to the one with the right. 10 years back, do you see the seasonality across the 12 months? That how many households were eating fresh fruits? That in the winter months, around 55-56% households were eating fresh fruits. But in the summer months, because more mangoes and variants of mangoes and lychee, and a lot of our fruits are summer fruits. So there was great degree of seasonality in the consumption of fresh fruits. Most Indians, nearly 77%, ate fresh fruits in the summer months of July, June, etc. All right. What about now? Look at the results 10 years later. 90% of Indians are eating fresh fruits throughout the year. There is no more seasonality. But it's not true that the fresh fruits are being grown everywhere all the time. No, it's your back-end supply chain, your cold storages, your excellent road network, your storage facilities, etc. So absolutely no seasonality now. And that's the reason I pick up fresh fruits, because unlike many other kinds of food items, these are highly perishable. And transportation and real-time storage and packaging, etc. These are measures of a growth or a progress in agriculture sector, right? And what's happening throughout the country. So food is now available in the form of fresh fruits throughout the year. People are eating all around the year. There's no more seasonality. It's an excellent indicator of supply chain improvement. Now let me link it to health. And I'm going to, of course, in the report, we study many different kinds of micronutrients, right? We study iron, zinc, vitamin A, folate, etc., etc. But for paucity of time, I'm only going to talk about iron because many of you can relate to this. Remember, the deficiency of iron is anemia, something that we have struggled with. And why is anemia particularly bad? Because it really accentuates, or it worsens, it exacerbates many kinds of ailments, particularly pregnancies, right? In pregnancies, anemia is very debilitating. So high-risk pregnancy, one of the measures is, does the mother, the pregnant lady, have anemia, right? So anemia is a big cause of concern. So let's see if people are eating more of all these things, is it impacting anemia? Now, the thing to remember, and again, this is 10 years past, and this is the latest. If you look at cereals, meaning if you include cereal in your food plate, then how much iron is an average Indian consuming? From the richest to the poorest. On an average, 9.9 milligram. So an average Indian, if you include cereal in your food plate, is consuming 9.9 milligram. But if you exclude cereal, that is what you see in the right-hand side panel. Without cereal, an average Indian is only consuming less than half of that. So 4.9 milligram of iron. What is the lesson from this? That cereals are the most important source of iron in rural India. This is the result for rural India. Because if you include cereal, then 9.9 milligram. If you exclude cereal, then we are only consuming 4.5 milligram. Okay, so cereals are very important for iron. And this is not surprising. Remember, we are fortifying our rice, right? We are fortifying it by iron. What about urban India? In urban India, the results are very similar. 9.9 milligram with cereals and 5.1 without. So cereals are the most important source of iron, even in urban India. So cereals are important for iron. What has happened over time, though, that if you look at, and this is where we use Shannon Diversity Index, you see we are bringing in concepts from different parts of the literature, right, in terms of measurements. Shannon Diversity Index is typically used, like when you study a biosphere, that how many kinds of species exist in a biosphere. And is this number decreasing? So there is atrophy or there's decline in diversity, or is there an increase in diversity? We use the same thing for the food plate of average Indians, that how many different sources of iron are there on your food plate. So we use and we estimate, we calculate the Shannon Diversity Index for rural India for iron. What do we find? That in 10 years, NSS 11-12 to NSS 22-23, the sources of iron, the diversity or the sources of iron has increased for all quintiles of households. Okay, so if you just look at it, I mean, food is, of course, getting more diverse, but here I'm looking at iron, sources of iron. If you eat many more different kinds of food, then the items from which you get iron are also many more. That is what this data is telling, that Indians are eating more diverse food items as far as iron is concerned. From the richest to the poorest, everybody is getting now iron from multiple sources. And this diversity, while it is true for richest to the poorest, it's also true for every state of the country. Every state, do you see the diversity? The blue dot and the standard error. You look at the estimates, they're all to the right, which means people of every state and union territory in India are eating more diverse food items for iron. Okay, and you can do this for everything, calcium, this thing. Now, here is an added nuance that eating habits are very different across different states. No, we know this. If you look at Kerala, then an average Keralaite gets 40% of her iron requirement from fresh fruits, only 22% from cereal. We are only sticking to iron. But what about Uttar Pradesh? In Uttar Pradesh, an average UPI is getting 70% of their iron from cereal and 14% from vegetables. So the diversity is very different. The food habits are very different. Look at Rajasthan. In Rajasthan, 84% of the iron is only coming from cereal. Vegetable is barely 7%. So Rajasthan, I have, of course, picked out these three to give you three very diverse culture. Rajasthan is very cereal heavy. Okay. UP, yes, consumes more vegetables than Rajasthan, but still cereal is important. 70% of your iron needs are coming from cereal. But look at Kerala, cereal is only 22%. 40% of your iron is coming from fresh fruits. Food habits are different. And food habits are different because the agroclimatic zones are very different. They grow very different kinds of things. So these are all interlinked. That's why I'm talking about also the production side. We have to link it. But the intake is from very different sources. Okay, that's the idea of showing this to you. Now, let us put the last piece of the puzzle. How does this affect anemia? If iron is what I'm focusing on, and now average Indian of all quintiles, every state is getting iron from many more sources, so diversity has increased. Does it impact anemia? Okay. You have two sets of results here. The left side panel is telling you what is the relationship between log value, average iron intake, and prevalence of anemia. Because here, the NSS data, consumption data, I'm joining it, combining or marrying the data with National Family Health Survey data, which tells you about the prevalence of anemia. And what do you notice? That when you consume more iron, just more iron, milligram, then prevalence of anemia comes down. That's why it's a negative relationship on the left side panel. But what about the right side panel? That tells you when diversity of iron sources increases, then anemia falls much sharper. So more iron reduces anemia. Very good. But more iron from different sources reduces anemia much more. So when we fortify our rice, when we put rice into iron into our rice mandatorily everywhere, it's an important policy instrument because we want to give more iron to people. And that is reducing anemia, but it is limited in its impact. What is reducing anemia even more or faster is when people are eating many more different kinds of food. So diversity of food matters much more. And this is what growth and development and prosperity is about. That people have access to, or they are eating very different kinds of food, okay? So more diverse food items reduces anemia much, much faster. And this is a very important takeaway, okay? Let me now switch gear to tell you a little bit about the vulnerability to the health shock when somebody is hospitalized, right? And by the way, what is happening to hospitalization in the country? Overall, and this is for the bottom 50%, that 17% of the poorer 50%, 17% households reported some hospitalization in a year. Now that number is 23%, which means the probability or the incidence of hospitalization has increased. But this doesn't mean that people are getting sicker more or need hospitalization more. It is really a marker of you accessing more. Earlier, you were not going to hospital because you didn't have the means. You neither had the funding, financing as Ayushman, even hospitals, etc. Availability was lesser, more expensive. So greater hospitalization overall, right? 5 percentage point increase. Improved access and affordability. So while incidence of hospitalization has increased, what is it doing to my consumption pattern? Or is it affecting my lifestyle? That is what consumption is about. You are seeing that the probability of decline in the household consumption status, that I'm in the rich 10% or the next 20% or the 30%, 40% and so on, the probability of falling due to hospitalization has reduced dramatically. And this is why we say that hospitalization-induced vulnerability has come down drastically for the poorer 50%. And this is directly linked to Ayushman Bharat, or the basically publicly financed health insurance scheme. So people are less vulnerable despite more hospitalization. That is the result. That people are less vulnerable, though they are getting hospitalized much more. That is what having proper healthcare or health financing is about, right? It's a very important metric. Very quickly on the asset ownership, and I'm only going to talk about the poorest 20%, okay? Because rich is not so much, from a welfare and poverty perspective. I often focus on the poorest. If you look at vehicular ownership, and I mean motorized vehicle. So what is a motorized vehicle in the bottom 20%? Typically, these are scooters, motorcycles, cars, and jeeps, right? And the left side panel is rural India, the right side panel is urban India. What do you notice? Then 2011-12, 4% of the poorest 20%, only 4% of people in that category had some vehicle. You know what is the number now after 10 years? 40%. That's a 900% increase. See how massive the jump is in terms of ownership of vehicles. And these are not government given, right? This is not toilet. This is not housing, Awas Yojana. These are scooters, motorcycles, and cars and jeeps amongst the poorest 20%. So something that you buy on your own. And remember, this is a durable good. This is not a cheap item. Which means this is also a very good indicator of what is happening to formal banking. Very few people go and give cash and buy motorcycle and scooter. Financing is possible. All right. So it's a good indicator of what is happening for formal banking, access to credit. And you see the results are very similar, rural and urban, massive. In fact, look at urban Punjab. Punjab has had, even in rural areas, from 14%, it has increased to nearly 66%. That is your poorest 20% Punjabi. Just look at it. Massive jump, right? And this is, so I'm showing you the results for all states for the poorest. Big jump everywhere. Now I want to change a little bit from the consumption to something on labor force, because we have been worried. We have been concerned about declining labor force participation of women in India. And we have often been lectured by a lot of the multilateral institutions, a lot of well-wishers and technocrats who visit have often asked that in India, you have to raise your women's labor force participation. Now, an important thing to understand, which is why I did this study, that, you know, none of these things are mechanical. You can't just switch on and say, "Achha, labor force participation of women will increase." These are outcomes of many things that exist in the society, okay? But let me show you the results to see what is happening. Now, first of all, labor force participation rate is the percentage of people in the working age of, and this is PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey, from the year 15 to 59. Okay, what percentage are actually either working or looking for work, which means they are in the labor force. All right. I'm going to show you the recent trends, what has happened to women's labor force participation in India. I'm going to show you what is marital status doing. So marriage, and this is where we are talking about a lot of now our institutions in society. Remember, I told you labor force participation is not a mechanical, it's not a standalone indicator which you can just increase or decrease. It's an outcome of many things in society. Marriage is one. Child, having a child is another. And then, of course, age. And some of these things, particularly age and all, you know, there's almost no literature on this. And another thing to remember, again, to the younger scholars, India is a very large country. All India estimates, all India numbers hide more. You really ought to be doing state level analysis, which is why almost all results that I'll show you for many of these things, and any report of mine you will read, you'll see state level estimates. India is very large. And a lot of these things, particularly labor markets, are local. It's a state subject. Okay, states have to notify and bring in laws, and a lot of these things are impacted by local conditions. So do them at state level. Okay, so I just defined to you what is labor force participation rate, and it includes, of course, 2.5 million observation, right? And I'm going to show you the results. Overall, what do they look like? PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey. Remember earlier in the previous regime, we used to wait every 5 years to get unemployment numbers or employment numbers. 5 years is too long to wait for a basic macro indicator like unemployment or labor force participation rate. So after that, we made a switch from 17 to Periodic Labor Force Survey, and we have had 6 rounds. The 7th has just come up. So I'm going to show you the results for this. What do you notice? Result number 1. From 2004-5 to 17-18, do you see a decline in labor force participation of women, rural and urban? And this is where 99% of the literature, in fact, I'm yet to see a major paper, which is why I had to take up this initiative, because I think there is a degree of fixation. You know, if you truly want to inform policy, you have to be, 1, curious. 2nd, you have to be ready to look at the data yourself. In India, unfortunately, there are very few scholars who ask first order questions. Kya ho raha hai? It is now 7 rounds, 8 rounds, and then we had to put a report like this to generally, basically because we are curious at how bad are things. Why is women labor force participation decreasing? And then we realize, well, all the literature talks about decreasing, but guess what has happened in the last 7 to 8 years? Look at it. Look how steadily it has increased. Not one paper to show this. And this is happening on the ground in your country, state after state, I'm going to show, particularly in rural India. So if this is happening, we better keep our ears on the ground. We have to know. That is how you then respond through policy interventions, and you shape your thinking and sort of the future planning and vision for the economy. So real-time data is important, and this is where you will see a lot of people ask for data. There's more and more. We want more data. We are very data hungry. But what about the analysis? You know, of course, we need more data. We are always asking for more data. But truly, today, the constraint in India is the analysis. We are not even doing justice to the already available enormous amounts of data. Under Digital India, everything is digitized today. And we aren't seeing. So again, I encourage you, and to any of you who are going to look at this and you want to replicate any of this is publicly available data. I've just run the analysis and I'm showing you results. All of this. You want to do this, you write to me. I'm very happy to share the codes with you. Okay, I want you to take this forward. Okay, so major reversal in rural and urban area in the last 7-8 years. One criticism is that, yeah, you guys have had a reversal, but you know what? Maybe this is because you are measuring unpaid work. So what the work which was traditionally unpaid, now you are measuring it as a part of labor force. Earlier you didn't consider it work, now you are. So how do you address a concern or a criticism like this? We look at all paid work. We say, acha, Sara unpaid work ko remove it from the analysis for the last 20 years. If you look at only paid work, you will still see the same trajectory. Do you see that? So no, this result is not being driven by measuring unpaid work into the labor force. Okay, there is something fundamental happening on the ground in rural and in urban. But do you notice that rural increase is much faster, much higher, just like rural decrease was? So there is clearly something happening. The big changes are in the rural area. Where is this change happening? So this is for all the states of the country. Overall labor force participation has increased from 24.6 in 17-18 to 41.5 in 22-23. But look at the states overall. Look at places like Madhya Pradesh. Look at Maharashtra. Look at Jharkhand. Look at Bihar. Bihar has increased from 3.9% to 23.3%. That is female labor force participation. Massive, massive. Traditionally, Punjab, Haryana, and Bihar. It's a crazy mix because Punjab, Haryana are your rich states, traditionally richer states. Bihar is traditionally poor. So it is not that in rich states women work more in the labor market, or in poor states they don't. You have to understand local conditions. Don't bunch and don't go with lazy theory. You have to look at the data to understand that even in your traditionally low labor force participation rates for women like Punjab, Haryana, and Bihar, you have had increases. Okay. And then, of course, the smaller states have seen some of the biggest. Nagaland, 15.7. It has increased to 71%. These are remarkable, massive, massive increase. Look at urban. Urban also. So rural, the changes are big. Urban, the changes are small, but the changes are there. The rise is there. Okay. Though much lesser. But every state of the country, barring Goa and Lakshadweep, which has had a minor sort of a decline. But overall, big changes. Now, let's look at female labor force participation between, so every state now over age group. What is the big key takeaway? That labor, traditionally, in data, you have labor force participation rate is 25% or 41%. It varies by age. That average means nothing. Do you notice everywhere it's a bell-shaped curve? So you enter the labor force around when you are 20, you stay in the labor force and then you exit. So it's a bell-shaped curve. All right. And do you see that the red bar or graph is always above the green one? Because labor force participation has increased in every state of the country for all age groups. That's what this is telling you. Okay. And I'm showing you, of course, the different zones, right? If you look at North and Central, PLFS. Look at Jammu Kashmir, Haryana, Punjab. Haryana and Punjab have seen the least amount of increase. The biggest increases are happening in Rajasthan. Just look at Himachal, etc. Now, if you look at eastern states, these are rural areas. You see the big dramatic increase? Urban area, less so in the eastern part, just like in the northern. Northeast, rural area, big increase. Urban, less so. South and the west, in rural area, this is the increase. In urban, increase is less. So every part, the magnitude is different, but the trajectory is very similar. Okay. Now here is an interesting thing: men, women versus age. So first of all, men and women both have labor force participation rate. With age, these are bell-shaped, meaning they increase and decrease. But you know what? For men, the entry is around 20 to 30, and then it remains almost 100%, and then it falls after 55, 60. But for women, the sharp increase, and they'll work only 15, 20 years, and the decline is after 40 and very sharp. So you see, average means nothing. You have to look at these details to understand context and culture. All right. And then come up with policies. In terms of men, rising sharply and then relatively flat, and then declines much later. And you see the data. Now, I'll show you the data in a minute. Marriage. Now, here is an interesting thing. Traditionally, we have said women are impacted by marriage, women's labor force participation. But you know what is the most remarkable thing? Marriage matters for men too. Your unmarried men have lower labor force participation rate. They are late to enter labor force. They are early to exit labor force. These are fascinating. And then it makes sense. The minute you start to understand and look at economics from an institutional point of view, you see that, yes, why is it that married men have much higher labor force participation? They enter soon and they work for long and they exit late. Because marriage is a disciplining mechanism. Just like, it's a requirement. Discipline is required for the labor market as well. It's a commitment. So we are also looking at traditional institutions to understand, labor force decisions or labor market decisions. For women, yes, marriage works, but works differently in different states. And marriage definitely lowers the labor force participation of women significantly, especially in urban areas, not in rural areas. In fact, in rural West Bengal, rural Rajasthan, married women tend to work more. It's remarkable. It's remarkable. So that is the power of data. That is the power of actually getting details at the local level. What about presence of children? It does not affect men, okay, in any perceptible way, but it does lower women's labor force participation in urban areas. And not for all age group. It's 20 to 35. So what you're now linking with that in urban area where women are 45% of your STEM graduates are women are more educated than ever. Today, the gross enrollment rate for women is higher than for men in India. We have more women in higher educational institutions in the country. Yet, when it comes to working in urban areas, if you are nuclear family, you don't have support, then, raising kid is a highly labor-intensive exercise. How are these women going to work if they don't have support, either institutionally in the form of childcare, right, or family? So that's why this age group, if we want women to work in urban area, we must provide care infrastructure. And remember, every time traditional institutions begin to break down, which is your joint family, somebody has to play the role, and that is what the state has to do. The state has to now provide some of these support which traditionally families did. That's why in India, we have to start investing much more in care infrastructure. Okay. Again, married men, look at men. Do you see married men enter early and they stay on late? The blue guys enter much later and they leave first. Everywhere, marriage is a disciplining mechanism. Marriage is important. Marriage is a good indicator of reliable workforce. You see? So there are many of these things which are on an average, of course. We're not talking about outliers. For women, it's mostly, but do you see, different states are different. Unmarried women work more in Punjab, in Haryana, in Uttar Pradesh. And married women work more in Rajasthan, Himachal Pradesh. So marriage, don't, look at the local data to understand what India is. India is very, very diverse. Our states are a good proxy for culture. Look at men, again, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, everywhere you're seeing similar results. For women, again, similar results. Right? Now, finally, I'll spend 2 minutes on new kinds of data. Like all your survey data has some human error, so we have to account for sampling, many other things. But new kinds of data, and for a long time, many of us in economics, we used to look at night lights data, like NASA or ISRO data. Now, you have very good daytime satellite data. Daytime satellite data is telling you 10 meter into 10 meter. In this case, if we use 100 meter into 100 meter, because it's lesser data points. But of course, if you had greater computing power, you can look at it even more minutely. You can look at exactly what is getting constructed. So high resolution data. This is the built up surface area. Now I'm showing you results, and this paper came out almost 8-9 months, or almost a year back. This is telling you what happened from 10 to 15 in terms of how much construction is happening in the country for every parliamentary constituency. But in the paper, you have not only parliamentary constituency, Because I wanted to see, well, does democracy, do your MPs, do they respond? Is there higher growth in certain kinds of constituencies than the other? Opposition versus the state, etc. And the results are there for districts as well. The results are there for sub-districts, like a subdivision. That is what 10 meter into 10 meter, you can do it for resident welfare association. That is the beauty of this data. What do you see? That the average growth build up is a measure of growth. It's a very good proxy for economic growth. Under the UPA2, which is 2010 to 2015, on an average, we had 2.8% growth. Okay. What do you see under Modi 1, 2015 to 20, 3.3%? Do you see there's a shifting? Every area has had higher growth. You can continue to do this every 5 years, okay? And we will update this. But if I look at the constituency geographically, where do you see? Red zones or red parliamentary constituencies are seeing of growth in excess, real growth in excess of 5%. These are the fastest growing. This is where your construction is maximum. Do you see, first of all, between 15 to 20, the redness itself has expanded? So it's not enough to say India is growing at this level. You have to say exactly where is it growing. And it is growing in many more parts. And the red zone or the red are also some of the most remote parts. Pay attention. It's happening in Western Rajasthan. It's happening in UP, Northern Madhya Pradesh. It's happening in Jharkhand, Northeast. Do you see that? How the redness is expanding. Which means your construction, your built up, actual building, creating stuff, roads, water tanks, all kinds of construction, which is a very good proxy for growth. Look at Tamil Nadu. You have areas of Tamil Nadu, all red now. Look at Maharashtra. So this is fascinating. High growth is the red. Now you can also look at what is the least, where is this happening? So on the x-axis, you have the least developed to the most developed. So less than 1% of the constituency was actually developed. To more than 35% of the constituency being developed. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the average growth. You're seeing the highest growth in the least developed parts. So our growth in terms of all infrastructure, connectivity, housing, everything has happened more than 6%. That's the average in the least developed parts. That's why I'm saying that our effort in the last 10 years has been to make every part of India connected and to focus much more on the least developed parts, the most remote parts. So there is reduction in inequality, if anything. If you look at this, these are sub-districts, so subdivision. Do you see under Modi 2015 to 20, 10 to 15 and 5 to 10. So you can also see UPA 1 and UPA 2. UPA 1, our average growth was 2.7. UPA 2, it was 2.8. These are subdivision levels, okay? And what do you see under NDA 1, in this case 2, I would imagine if NDA 1 was Vajpayee, 3.4. So you're seeing how growth has picked up. Growth has picked up in subsequent. But there's no statistically, UPA 1 and UPA 2 are very similar. 2.7 and 2.9 aren't that different, but 3.4 is a major jump. And look at how, you have had many constituencies with more than 9% growth. That's remarkable growth year on year. Again, highest growth, almost 7% in the least developed subdivisions, right? Moving forward, and I want to end here because I know there are many of you interested in policy and analysis and so on. We need to build capacity for evidence-based policy making, right? The research capacity in the government everywhere, in every country of the world is limited. Most research capacity sits outside. But I'm not talking about consulting firms and people who help us with quick fixes. We are talking about, strong training and perseverance and really a culture of research and empirical research. We need very rigorous empirical research inputs to do real-time policy making in such a dynamic and fast-growing complex economy such as India. Economists in many ways are trained. The uniqueness of this profession is that we are trained to meet this kind of knowledge gap. Our training in empirical or data science is also motivated by a lot of theory in economics. Right? So our empirical training does give us a unique advantage. So I really do think to the economists in this audience, this is a call and a motivation to get you to work on some of these issues, work on any issue, but just put together a story in the form of what is happening on the ground. And of course, we are also thinking of ways in which, the National, the Research Foundation, etc. Now we have a lot of new sources of funding. So to the scholars, to the academics, to the younger lot interested, do reach out. I'm happy to connect you with different institutions which are looking for support in this within the government and outside, because that is the need for, what Vikasit Bharat is aiming to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi. That was really insightful. I remember the snippets of being shared on social media once, and I followed a lot of these, but the kind of big picture that came up right now. And I think one of the these, I'm not an economist, I'm sure a lot of them who are not economists, they conventionally look at inequalities through just incomes. But this is another way to sort of look whether that inequality exists or not. And I think this is a very, for us, it was first time to see such a data being used to explain how growth has happened. So Dr. Ravi, thank you very much for that very insightful talk. There are a few questions. In fact, we had circulated the sheet with our followers in terms of if you have any questions. So there are a few questions which some of them incidentally may come to your talk, but then there are certain things that generally about uh, economy, policy, and what they are expecting. So one of the first questions is, do you see, that's what the question is, competitive entitlement politics that is coming up,
Yeah.
in a sense that I'm assuming this is follow up on what happened in Maharashtra about Ladki Bahin, and then every state wants to sort of go into that. Do you think this competitive entitlement politics is eventually going to drain out our resources, that there needs to be a way to settle it down, and if a government like this exists, then they should lead with an example?
That's an excellent question. And it's important to understand the origin of something. We have been following a policy of saturation now for the last 10 years, which means basic amenities must be made available to all citizens everywhere in the country. That basket of amenities, it started with, of course, very simple things such as Aadhaar, Jan bank account, mobile connectivity. So not all of it is just government driven. If you look at toilets, housing, electricity, right, piped drinking water, piped water in general, that basket has been expanded. But that is the nature of development and prosperity for a country, that we need to meet basic needs of people. And that's where you should also think of the food grain, etc., as being one. Like I showed you, we are fiscalizing, which means all of that saving is going elsewhere. That it originated from that sense, the basic amenities. But what is happening today are not in the general understanding of an amenity. Why should a cash, if a certain amount, be thought of as an amenity? The origin of it really happened when, let's say, when we are targeting high-risk pregnant women, right? So that's why women. We are looking at women who drop out because of whatever problems, or there are issues of basic nutrition, right? Huge malnutrition, etc. And the state doesn't have the last mile connectivity to make the take-home ration available on a real-time basis of a decent quality. There have been instances when the take-home ration is made available, but it's terrible quality, so people might throw it away, etc. Right? You have to understand that the origin of some of these programs started in states where the last mile government capacity to make things available like nutrition, right, basic primary kind of a healthcare, etc., which are long-standing problem. Cash is seen as a sure shot way of making some impact. That when 1,000 rupee comes into the hands of a woman in the house, at least she will consume, let's say, 100 rupee, 150, even though others might consume. But it is seen as a sure shot way to make an impact. It started from that. That is the motivation. But very quickly, and of course, there is global evidence that, a conditional cash transfer, or sometimes even unconditional cash transfers, have been very efficient. But while it is efficient, it is not a substitute for government capacity. Right? We can't give cash and say, okay, now do everything on your own, rest, buy it from the market. No. Market failures happen. That is why there is a role for the government. Unfortunately, what has happened, it is not so much the cash to the hands of the women which is a problem today. That is not fiscally such a big dent, because your returns in terms of the evidence that is coming is that maternal mortality is indeed falling. Nutritional outcomes are indeed improving. Okay, so the problem is not there. The problem is when, because of these frequent elections, the electoral politics are making states completely disregard their fiscal situation, right? So they are going over and beyond their means to spend money on what is non-development targets. So going back on the pension scheme, remember after 20 years, you got in a very progressive new pension scheme. And then Himachal reversed it, right? Then Punjab reversed, and then state after state wanted to reverse. The problem here is these are active reforms, which is making growth and welfare more viable, right? So this is healthy growth. We're going back, but that is also not the whole problem. The problem is that whom does it benefit? 5% of the state, which is well coordinated, well mobilized, 5% of the government employees. And the data clearly tells you that the money is going to come from development spending, right? And very clearly you saw in Karnataka when the deputy chief minister says, look, we have no more money, don't expect development from us because we've given you all these freebies. So the money therefore always comes from development spending. So from hospitals, from welfare, from colleges, from schools, right? Local roads, etc., etc. This is where I encourage you that if you're interested in these kind of things and what is the fiscal situation of a state and which are the states which are at the brink or some of them who have also surpassed and therefore are looking for legal solutions and interventions from Supreme Court, etc. Read a report I put out almost a year and a half back called State of State Budgets in India. Observational analysis, where you are seeing 30 years trend for every state. There are states which are not in a position to generate revenue. What are you going to distribute? And if you do distribute, what is going to continue to fund it? The problem is, for instance, when someone said, oh, if Punjab, if they want to give freebies to farmers, if they have the money, let them give it. But economics means you have the money today, Akshay.
Yeah.
You're not going to continue having the money. Because what happened in Punjab? Active deindustrialization. You were taking from industry to give to farmers.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
because you made the policy so lopsided, you started charging so much power tariff and so many labor and all kinds of regulations you put, extra cost, the burden, that industry just moved away. They moved to Himachal, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, etc. You have actively deindustrialized in 20 years. So now you don't even have the money to give. So you have to think of viability and you have to think of long-term implications, not one budget and one election, etc.
In fact, since you spoke of Punjab, I just want to take that question, though it was a bit later, but I thought I'll just bring it here. This was coming from slight grievance from the government, I'm assuming. And the question is that this government promised a lot of reforms economically, but it has been more focused on delivery patterns than new reforms. And even the farm reforms were taken back. So is this government, are we going to see any major reforms? Are farm bills going to be reintroduced anytime in the future?
The farm laws, the beauty of the Indian fiscal structure is that what did not go through as a central act, right? The laws. Many states have already brought in those reforms at their own.
Okay.
Today, the resistance, in fact, when you look at data and you start analyzing the nature of resistance to some of these reforms, and agriculture is in dire need of it. The resistance to the farm laws is only from not even three states,
Two states
really
primarily.
one state. And these are the most affluent, the richest, etc. 86% of farmers supported it, but we had to take it back.
Yeah.
Right? But the thing about large fiscal federal structure is that states are very powerful. Okay, and agriculture really sits at that where states have a tremendous power to bring in a lot of elements of this reform as they have. So your biggest growth in terms of agricultural growth are happening in states like Andhra Pradesh, fisheries, vegetables. It's happening in Madhya Pradesh, pulses, oilseeds. It's happening in Bihar, massive diversification away from food grains, etc. So you see,
Right.
many states are already doing it. But I
Yeah.
think that you have to also understand that, well coordinated resistance can also, remember, many farm agitations were happening throughout the world.
Yeah.
And Sweden shot down many farmers, Germany shot down many farmers, Canada shot down many farmers. I think in India, actually, you have to understand that the nature of the government is very different. And the way we run our society is also very different. We never want to give states so much power that you can gun down people if it comes in the way of your agenda.
Yeah.
Right? So the laws have made their way. But of course, we still continue to worry about a state like Punjab, which is in dire need of not just agriculture, by the way, major economic overall.
Right. In fact, some of the things that you mentioned in your lecture also today suggest that there are alternative ways to get things done and analyzed as well. So, like maybe not centrally, but at federal level, this could be happening. But there is another important question, which slightly is from a different lateral, but says that the economic study in India has not is there a way to understand Indian economy through a particular lens? I mean, the question says that we have studied Gandhian economics, we have studied Nehruvian economics. Now, a lot of people talk about liberal economics. Is the direction? Is there any direction that India is going? Now, I sense that this is a student who is asking, who's trying to probably understand it. But I want to sort of ponder on the pragmatism of policymaking and being ideological or unideological. But if you want to take that question,
Yeah. So that's a great question. You know why? Because when I went to college in Lady Shri Ram, a college in Delhi University 25, 30 years, 30 years, we used to have a subject called economic thought. And I really think we have to reintroduce a lot of these subjects.
yeah,
Because unfortunately, economics has also the study of economics, the subject of economics has also become very mechanical, right? And yet, economics, remember, is a social science. You have to understand institutions and context to really understand
yeah,
why some things are happening.
right,
So, of course, it's a mixed economy in India. But I think even the most liberal markets, even the most capitalist market, like let's say the US,
yeah,
government is a very major player in these markets. Government contracts are huge.
right,
If you look at, the famous, I mean, look at your iPhones.
yeah,
95% of the cost of development of a product like this was borne by the government because they gave so much subsidy and funding for development of these kind of technology.
right,
So government is an important part everywhere. In fact, the more free the market and the more capitalist or, again, market are
yeah,
very important. You need strong regulators to make markets function well,
yeah,
right? But I think one thing to students in economics that I want to again encourage you to do, that we have to go back to some of the founding principles of what is truly, liberal economics. It
yeah,
has to do with empowering citizens,
right, right,
right? So that the government doesn't become a Mai Baap Sarkar.
right,
And which is, by the way, the philosophy that we have followed in this government last 10 years, that basic amenities we are going to make available
right,
so that you become productive, or the country has 100 years of sustained economic growth by raised human capital productivity, for many decades. So you don't have to worry about food and water and electricity and roads. And these are
right,
first order basic needs. So you have to view this as what happened in the US after the World War. Major expansion in basic amenities, which goes to raise overall productivity, right? For decades and decades. So that's why I keep saying 100 years. That's the way we have to look at it. And then we have to look at, uh, the role of an individual and not to be over dependent. I think government should really be in areas where market failures exist. After all, what is India's growth in the last 30 years experiment? What has it shown us? 35
yeah,
years. It has shown us that our private enterprise is remarkable. There's massive growth, right? This
yeah,
massive increase we have had, the area of exponential growth, which has led to many-fold increase in per capita income, right? Tells us that private enterprise, we have to trust people and their enterprise and the incentives which go into building economy. But the state's role is also very important because it is this growth which has also led to improvement in development indicators. We have reduced poverty. Well, we've been talking about it for 75 years. It's only now that our absolute poverty is below 3%. So you see, growth is important. It's a necessary condition. But you need a well-functioning and a right-minded government to really, redistribute in ways that you address critical sustainable development goals like absolute poverty, etc.
Thank you. In fact, that is one thing which I think Justice Ranade also spoke about in his economic when he talked about a very constructive role of state to provide private enterprise the ability to actually be self-dependent. I think, thank you, Dr. Ravi, for that really insightful question amongst us and also the session. I'm sure all of us enjoyed it. We were waiting for you to have this session, and you've taken out a lot of time for us. So I want to thank you. I also want to thank all of you for joining. The paper which Dr. Ravi was talking about, we'll make sure that it's there in the comment section. The link for it will be there in the comments, so you can directly go and download that. I myself will be doing first thing once I'm done with here because I read the snippets of it, but I think the full paper worth its read a lot. So do share how you feel about this lecture. Do let us know in the comments. Share it amongst your acquaintances and stay tuned with us. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much.